Excitement is in the air for the Atlanta Falcons following their 2023 NFL draft haul. We'll talk about why they passed on Jalen Carter, and we'll talk about some of the remaining holes for this team moving forward.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And I want to thank everyone that makes this illustrious podcast their first listen. Shout out to all of my everydayers. I know it's been a long week. The draft is complete, but I really appreciate everyone who showed up throughout the last several days to listen and watch all the frequent content that we had here on Locked On Falcons over these last couple of days. I do this for you because I'm so humble. But make sure you follow their path set by those everydayers by subscribing or following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcast. So today's episode, we'll talk a little bit about the decision to pass on Jalen Carter and why we're moving past that decision here on Locked On Falcons. We'll talk about some of the remaining holes on the Falcons roster that they did not necessarily address in the draft and some possible avenues where they could, some of the key camp battles, some of the things that we'll be keeping an eye on, certain roster spots throughout the summer in the lead up to the season. But first, let's talk about where the direction of this team, right? So we wrapped the 2023 NFL draft, and of course, opinions are mixed on whether or not, the Falcons did a good job. That's the case with any and all drafts, right? Some people love it, some people hate it, but everybody has an opinion and they have no qualms about sharing it. But rather than focusing on, the draft and what exactly the Falcons got, let's integrate this draft conversation into the bigger picture that is the Atlanta Falcons. And for me, this is an exciting time in Falcon fandom that I think I referenced on yesterday's episode, talking about this is the first time in 5 years that I felt like, this team is headed in the right direction. And it echoes the comments made from Calais Campbell, where I was rocking the shades on the previous episode about how bright this future is for the Atlanta Falcons. And you look at the things that are pointing up for the Falcons. They have a young quarterback, showed a lot of promise. I know there are going to be people out there that disagree with that notion, but and we'll probably wind up doing a deeper dive on Desmond Ridder and why he's got a promising future here in Atlanta in the coming days and weeks on this podcast. I'm working on an article for the Falcoholic, so I'm trying to get that synergy going. But, there are early indicators that, a young, cheap quarterback like Desmond Ridder that has the potential to be one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL is a force multiplier, right? A top 10 to top 15 quarterback on a rookie deal is basically a force multiplier for team building in the NFL. And the Falcons have the potential to have that force multiplier in Desmond Ridder. You have the dynamic skill talent, on the offense at running back, receiver, and tight end. Of course, you add Bijan Robinson, give yourself perhaps the NFL's best running back duo. There are other teams that may be contenders, but I'll put my money on the Atlanta Falcons with Bijan Robinson and Tyler Allgeier. You have that dominant running game. And, the thing I've always said here on the Locked On Falcons is I don't really care what your identity is as long as you go out there and are just basically the best version of that identity. And for the Atlanta Falcons, that is that dominant running game. We know Arthur Smith wants to run the piss out of the ball. And so I sit here and I go, Arthur Smith, if that's what you want to do, let's do it. And the Falcons have the ability to do that, running the ball 13 straight times, 3 to Bijan, 3 to Allgeier, 3 to CP, getting back to Bijan for 2 and Allgeier for 2. You absolutely will love to see it on Sundays this year for the Atlanta Falcons. And I know that's not everybody's cup of tea in terms of the style and identity of offense that they would like to see, but I promise you guys, if it works, the tea will taste good, right? Then you look at the pass catchers, the two primary pass catchers in Kyle Pitts and Drake London, right? They're so good. In fact, we know they're so good because little more than a month ago, everybody on the planet insisted that Lamar Jackson having those two weapons here in Atlanta were so beyond any other weapons that he had in Baltimore and any other team could have possibly imagined. So anybody who's sitting here telling you that the Falcons don't have enough skill position talent in terms of the pass catchers is lying to you, because a month ago everybody insisted on the planet that, this was the greatest possible destination for a quarterback of Lamar Jackson caliber. So it's the greatest possible destination for any quarterback of any caliber. So we'll see how that goes. Then you look at the offensive line stability, right? You've locked up Caleb McGarry for at least 2 more years. You have Chris Lindstrom locked up for at least 3 more years. Drew Dahlman is cost control for at least 2 more years. Matthew Bergeron is cost control for 4 more years. Jake Matthews is locked up for at least 2 more years. So you have the potential to have the same starting 5 for at least 2 more years here in Atlanta that can really lay the foundation for offensive stability. And we haven't had that level of stability on the offensive line in several years, right? You go back 2 to 3 years where from 2015 to 2017, when they had relatively that level of stability with, mostly the same starters during those years. 08 to 2010, you had basically the same starters. And it's not, to me, a coincidence that those teams across those 6 seasons that we're talking about won about 65% of their games during that time. Again, it's not all due to the offensive line stability, but that certainly was a big factor. And the Falcons really have an opportunity that this regime has been able to lay the groundwork for a stable offensive line for many years ago, not just 2 to 3 years, but potentially, if some of these guys live to the contract, 5 or more years and beyond. So we'll see how that goes. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball. The Falcons made many upgrades on the defensive side of the ball, right? So many people are mad that the Falcons, quote unquote, ignored their pass rush in the draft. And it's like, sure, they ignored their pass rush in the draft, but did you guys sleep during the month of March? Because the Falcons went out and spent $50 million in guaranteed money on pass rushers this offseason. That's the equivalent of an entire Myles Garrett to upgrade their pass rush in March, right? If you factor in, Zach Harrison's 3.5 sacks that he had last year at Ohio State, they've added 25 sacks this offseason across multiple players to the 17 that they're keeping from last year. That's 40 plus sack potential. We've talked about this here on the podcast. The Falcons haven't had 40 sacks in the season since 2004. They have now the best chance to hit that benchmark in almost 19 years, in almost 2 decades. So you see not only the pass rush being upgraded, you see promising young talent at all 3 levels of the Falcons defense. You got Arnold Ebiketie up front. You got Troy Anderson in the middle. And on the back end, you got a very young, talented secondary. AJ Terrell, Richie Grant, Jeff Okudah, Clark Phillips, Jesse Bates, all these guys. You got a young trio of corners that have a lot of upside, right? All 3 of these guys have top 50 draft talent. I know Clark Phillips went in round 4. I know, Jeff Okudah got traded for a 5th round pick, but was a top 3 pick. The oldest players in the Falcons secondary are Mike Hughes and Jesse Bates, and both of these guys just turned 26 in February. You have the potential of having one of the best young secondaries in the NFL. We might be old up front, right? But we're young on the back end. And we'll see how good this defense, with this youth on the back end and that age and veteran experience up front, grows under the new defensive coordinator, Ryan Nielsen. But he's been hailed as one of the up-and-coming coaches in the NFL. And there's a chance in a few years that with the growing and gelling that this unit has, with the continued adding talent that they'll have in future years, again, it's not as if like this is the end of the line and they will never be able to add another player ever again. You have the potential here to grow into one of the better defenses in the NFL. And when was the last time we've said that about an Atlanta Falcons defense? Right? Again, I know we're not that far removed from people saying, hey, I think this Falcons defense is starting to come together. Well, guys, it's time to brush off the old statements. Hey, I think it's time maybe this Falcons defense is starting to come together. So we'll see how that goes, right? So again, like I said at the top of the show and on yesterday's episode, this is, the first time in 5 years that I felt good about the direction of the team. I remember back in the 2018 offseason where I wasn't in love with all the moves the Falcons made, but I was like, you know what? It's going to be fine. This team is good. I know they're going to be good. It's going to still be all right. I haven't felt that way since that 2018 offseason, right? And I'm sure many of you guys still have questions about how good this team is going to be. I have questions about this, how good Desmond Ridder is going to be, how effective Arthur Smith is going to be to integrate all the skill position talent, how quickly can his offensive line gel, how much better is his pass rush actually going to be. It's a 40 sack unit on paper, but is it going to be a 40 sack unit on the field? How good of a defensive coordinator is Ryan Nielsen? Is Troy Anderson, going to be the guy that's going to keep it all together, and as well as other individual players that you could point out as question marks? I have all those same questions, and we're going to hope to answer as many of those questions over the next 3 months, right? As these guys get on the practice field for training camp and then eventually play real football games at some point in September. And anybody who's been a longtime listener to Locked On Falcons knows that this is not the podcast to come to if you want to hear how I'm sitting here going, hey, the Falcons going to win 13 games and win the Super Bowl this year. This ain't the place for that. But this is the place where if you are excited about the Falcons' future, as excited as I am, this is the place for you. You should be excited as I am. And so I sit here and I go, do you want to spend the next 3 months talking about positional value? Because if that's all you really care about, this ain't the podcast for that, but I'm sure there's a podcast out there. But I'm sure many of you guys don't really care to listen to a podcast that sits here and complains about positional value, right? I imagine many of you would rather listen to the podcast that's going to discuss all the creative ways that Arthur Smith can utilize different personnel groupings to keep defenses off balance throughout the season. You want to listen to a podcast that's going to talk about the different wrinkles that Ryan Nielsen is going to do on the defensive side of the ball with stunts and blitzes and the various coverages, right? But I'm sure some of you guys have decided, wait, I just don't like the Falcons. Hell, I don't like the Falcons, guys, right? But I'm very passionate about this team, but I'm not passionate about positional value, right? And that's not the reason why I dislike the Falcons, because they just don't know how to maximize positional value in the draft, right? I'm sure, maybe this is the case for you, but my first memories of watching football with my dad in the 1900s was not him waxing poetic about positional value and the ins and out of that and how teams must maximize their positional value in the NFL draft. So I'm sorry. If that's how you were raised, then so be it. But we are not going to talk about positional value. We're going to talk about the exciting ways that the Atlanta Falcons are have the potential to be over the next couple of months. And I hope you guys come along for the journey and make us your first listen. But we will continue on this journey of being anti-positional value here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. And we'll talk about the decision to pass on Jalen Carter, right? Because, that gets to the core of some people's gripes about positional value. Why take a running back when you could take a pass rusher? All that and more. We'll talk about that. And we'll talk about Jalen Carter, and it'll probably be the last time we'll talk about Jalen Carter on the Locked On Falcons podcast. If you want to get your Jalen Carter content after today, you'll have to head on over to Locked On Eagles. Gino and Louie do a great job over there, so highly recommend you guys check them out if you want more Jalen Carter content. But we'll put a button on the Jalen Carter issue in the Falcons' decision to pass on that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about the delicious snack that is great for you, because you don't have to necessarily deal with all the sugar and calories. And I'm talking, of course, about Built Bars, the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar. Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate, but they're low in sugar. They're low in calories. They have a whopping 17 grams of protein. They come in great flavors. If you head on over to built.com right now, you can get the limited time flavors like cookie dough chunk puff, peanut butter puff, snickerdoodle chunk puff, or you can go and order yourself a mix box so that you can try all their different flavors. And when you do, make sure you use the promo code LOCKEDON15 and you'll get 15% off your order at built.com. But even better than that, if you don't want to head on over to built.com and try all those different flavors, you can just head on over to your local Walmart or Sam's Club and find yourself a Built Bar box. Head on over to Walmart, go to the pharmacy section, grab yourself a 4-bar box of cookies and cream or double chocolate. Or if you're at Sam's, you can grab a 13-bar box of Barony Batter Puff or Churro Puff. So many Falcon fans over the years have come up to me and said, Aaron, you have absolutely changed my life. I'm so humble. And you have introduced me not only to the greatness and glory that is Bijan Robinson, but you have also introduced me to the glory and greatness that are Built Bars. So guys, check them out. You will thank me later. So once again, want to give a shout out to all my everydayers that check out the podcast. We'll continue breaking down the Falcons draft class in the coming days and weeks. going through all the various players, have various guests on the pod in the coming days and weeks, and I'll give you my film study breakdown of these various players. So we have a lot of draft related content over the next 6 weeks, but none of that content will be related to the topic I'm about to talk about today, which is Jalen Carter. So I would like today to be the last time we really talk about Jalen Carter in earnest on the podcast. And it goes to the conversation that we've been having all the time, best player available. We draft the best player available. And Bijan Robinson, was he the best player available, or was somebody else best player available? And the answer is Bijan Robinson wasn't the best player available. You will get me to admit that. Jalen Carter was the best player available. I've said so for months. He's the best player in this draft class. We've been talking about the Falcons getting Jalen Carter on this podcast since July of last year. In fact, we probably were talking about Jalen Carter being the best player on the Georgia team last year in given all the hype around Jordan Davis. And like, yeah, Jordan Davis is good, but he ain't no Jalen Carter, right? So I am sad, like many of you, that the Falcons did not draft Jalen Carter. But I am very happy that he went to Philadelphia because, frankly, from my mind, if he wasn't going to be an Atlanta Falcon, that was the best situation for him, and arguably even a better situation for him than Atlanta. And, I might say some things, I have said some things that will rile up some Georgia fans on today's episode, and I have certainly said some things. And, I get it. You root for certain players for, 3 to 5 years in college, and then you kind of want to root for them playing for your favorite team, especially here in Atlanta. For many of you, there's an overlap there, for the next 3 to 5 years. And, a lot of Georgia fans in the last couple of days have been, good organizations draft Georgia players. Just look at Philadelphia as Exhibit A. And I get that, right? The Philadelphia Eagles have been a very successful organization the last couple of years. In 2017, they won a Super Bowl. You know how many Georgia players they had on that team? Just one. It was Darnell Ellaby, who they picked up midseason. By the way, Darnell Ellaby has 2 Super Bowl rings. He got one with Baltimore and Philadelphia. But they only had 2 Georgia players on last year's team, right? That's more than they had in 2017, and they lost the Super Bowl. So clearly, we have to conclude that having more Georgia players on your team means it actually decreases the chances of winning Super Bowl. Of course, I don't actually believe that, but it is notable to me that, everybody's like, oh, well, Philadelphia has Georgia players. They invest in Georgia players. They're a winning organization. It's like, yeah, they went to the Super Bowl last year, but they had more players on their roster, not from Georgia, but from Alabama, Nebraska, and Florida State, right? They had just as many players from Temple, ODU, and West Virginia as they had Georgia players on their team. So clearly, if you want to be a successful organization, you got to draft players from Old Dominion, right? So the Falcons not drafting Nick Saldiveri and Zach Kuntz, is going to doom them to failure. And of course, I don't say this earnestly and actually believe this, right? But it's this sort of sentiment that you often hear from college football fans that cause me often to be very condescending towards college football fans, that they are not well-adjusted people, right? This correlation that team success is based off of how many Georgia players you have on your roster, or how many players from any school you have on your roster. It's silly, right? But there's nothing wrong with Georgia fans or anybody wanting your favorite team to draft certain players, right? Your favorite college football players. That's all we do, right? I'm happy that the Falcons drafted Bijan Robinson. He was my favorite player in the draft. Not the best player in the draft, but he was my favorite player in this draft class. And I'm happy that the Falcons drafted him, right? So what I will say is, I think people acting like the Falcons not drafting Jalen Carter or not drafting certain players is evidence that they stink. Again, I don't think makes a ton of sense. But, rather than going to war with Georgia fans, right, I want to talk about Jalen Carter, right? And yes, the Falcons passed on Jalen Carter, and we'll find out in a few years if that was a mistake. But the Falcons weren't the only team that passed on Jalen Carter. 6 other teams passed on Jalen Carter. So when we sit here and act like the Falcons passed on Jalen Carter because they're stupid and they're an idiotic organization, that's just not fair to the Atlanta Falcons, because they, along with 6 other teams, passed on Jalen Carter, and we all know the reason why, right? And time will tell on whether or not Jalen Carter will outperform those expectations or those limitations or whatever you want to call it, and wind up having a good career. And we'll look back and know with clarity of hindsight in a few years whether or not all these other teams made a mistake, right? I think he's set up for success in Philadelphia, but 6 teams passed on Jalen Carter, right? We'll give Carolina the benefit of the doubt, Houston the benefit of the doubt, by taking quarterbacks 1-2. Same thing with Indianapolis. But starting with that number 3 overall spot, right? Arizona had a chance to take Jalen Carter. They traded out. Houston came back up to get a non-quarterback, right? They took Will Anderson instead of Jalen Carter. At the number 5 spot, Seattle had a chance to take Jalen Carter. Everybody had been saying, oh, Seattle's going to take Jalen Carter. If they get a chance, they passed on him, and they took Devin Witherspoon. Detroit now had a chance to take Jalen Carter, and boy, did they need a defensive tackle. But they traded out, and Arizona had another chance, a second swing to take Jalen Carter, and they passed on him for Paris Johnson. And then the Raiders had a chance to take Jalen Carter. They need D-tackle help, and they passed on him for Tyree Wilson. The Falcons passed on Jalen Carter for Bijan Robinson. And then the 6th team that we're talking about that isn't the Atlanta Falcons, the Chicago Bears were sitting there at 9 with the chance to take Jalen Carter, and they absolutely needed D-tackle help because they wound up drafting 3 defensive tackles in this draft, but yet they traded out with the Philadelphia Eagles to only take Darnell Wright 1 pick later. So again, 6 teams passed on Jalen Carter this past year. 5 of those teams wound up drafting a defensive tackle later in the draft: Arizona, Chicago, Detroit, Las Vegas, and Seattle. Right? There's a reason why teams passed on Jalen Carter, guys. And if you go and read the bios of the players that teams passed on Jalen Carter for, whether we're talking about Will Anderson and Devin Witherspoon or Paris Johnson, Bijan Robinson, Tyree Wilson, you're going to hear blurbs in their bios with Dane Brugler's The Beast: competitive drive, competes with the tenacity of a junkyard dog. You know that's Devin Witherspoon that he's describing there. He sets the example. He's a disciplined player that takes football seriously. He's a quick learner. He's coachable. He's confident leader. He's a positive influence in the locker room. And then you read Jalen Carter's blurb, right, from Dane Brugler and The Beast. And he's a young player. NFL Scout says he's still just a kid. And NFL teams are hoping he continues to mature once he gets to the league. And NFL Scout said, did Kirby Smart have to ride him hard sometimes? Yeah. Does he need to grow up and learn how to be a pro? Yeah. But you could say that about most of these kids. That's fair, right? I don't know anything about Jalen Carter, the person. I know the player. The player is one of the best football players I've seen. And I'm not sitting here trying to paint Jalen Carter as a bad person. Ultimately, I don't think he's a bad person. I think he's maybe a little bit immature. He's made some questionable choices, especially at that night in January this past year. But I'm not here to assassinate his character. But I'm trying to explain to you guys why the Falcons, among 6 other teams, chose not to draft Jalen Carter, right? Because these teams picking in the top 10 are making $25, $30, $40 million investments in guaranteed money to these players that they're using these top 10 selections on. And these teams don't want to pay that money. And then, one night after practice or whatever, lay down to go to sleep and then get a phone call at 3 a.m. saying something's gone wrong. And 3 years from now, we'll know, right? Again, we'll have the clarity of hindsight, whether or not the Falcons were mistaken, and any of these other teams were mistaken in passing on Jalen Carter. And I suspect we will feel like they were mistaken because Jalen Carter went to Philadelphia, and that's the best environment for him to basically make all of these teams, including the Atlanta Falcons, regret that choice, because he's going to go and join a locker room that has former teammates at Georgia that have a vested interest in making sure that Nick Sirianni never gets that phone call at 3 a.m. We saw how that locker room handled CJ last year, where the reason why the Saints traded Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was because of all the antics he was pulling there. And they were like, we just got to get rid of this headache. And so he goes to Philadelphia. I read this article last year. He goes to Philadelphia and he starts doing all the same stuff he was doing in New Orleans that got him kicked out of town there. And the Eagles locker room says, no, that's not going to fly. They checked him. And he was like, oh, okay, my bad. I was just seeing where the line was. Now I'm going to back off. And the rest is history, and that team winds up going to the Super Bowl in large part thanks to a great defense. And so to me, that's the perfect situation for Jalen Carter to join that type of organization and that type of locker room that's going to make teams like the Falcons look stupid. So if you're a Georgia fan, be happy that Jalen Carter got to go to Philadelphia. This is the perfect place for him. Not necessarily upset that he's not in Atlanta Falcons. So I'm looking forward, or really not looking forward, to that mailbag question come 2026 when someone asks me, hey, Aaron, do you think the Falcons made a mistake for passing on Jalen Carter? We'll see, right? But I'll worry about that question in 2026. For now, I'm not worried about that in 2023. And so I'm moving on from Jalen Carter, right? And I want to say to all of you guys watching or listening to the show, by all means, tell me, you have my permission to air your grievances about the Falcons' decision to pass on Jalen Carter. Tell me how you feel, right? And I want everybody else in the comments. You don't need to argue with them. Just give them the space to air their grievances, right? To your feelings are valid. I'm upset. I'm frustrated. I'm angered. I'm disappointed that the Atlanta Falcons did not draft Jalen Carter. And here's the reasons why. And let them get it out. Don't jump in the comments and attack them and say you're a fake fan or you're a hater or you're an idiot or any of that stuff. Just let them out. Their feelings are valid. Let them collectively air their grievances. If you want to jump in the comments and air your issues with the Falcons passing on Jalen Carter, if you want to send me an email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, hit me up on Twitter. It's fine, guys. Your feelings are valid. But now that you've aired those grievances, let's all move on. Let's process those emotions, that anger and that frustration, and let's all move on. And let's talk about the team that we have, not the team that we could have had. That's all I'm asking. So we will move on from Jalen Carter and talk about the current state of the Falcons roster and where areas they could still get some help. Or are they going to get some wide receiver help? We'll talk about that as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So, guys, wrapping up today's Locked On Falcons, we'll talk about the state of the Falcons roster. We did a breakdown last week, I believe, on the biggest holes and areas of the Falcons roster. We had some graphics. They weren't great. We won't have graphics on today, so we'll just outline them. You'll just have to follow along without the visual references. But let's start with the defense. I feel like overall, collectively, there are less question marks on the defensive side of the ball. Up front, you got the big defensive end that we wanted behind Calais Campbell and Zach Harrison. We wondered if maybe they would get some nose tackle depth because we're not necessarily 100% sure Eddie Goldman is going to be a contributor here in Atlanta, how committed he is to playing football this year after, several iffy seasons. But I do think, with the addition of Zach Harrison, that may move a player like Jalen Dalton to the inside, someone like Timmy Horn. So those are guys that at least have some experience that could push Eddie Goldman and be sort of insurance policies if Eddie Goldman isn't ready to be Eddie Goldman this season. So I feel like the defensive line is pretty solid. I do think there are concerns at the linebacker position. Thought we might get another linebacker depth piece in this draft. They did not. But between Tay Davis, Dorian Etheridge, Nate Landman, I feel like they have enough options there where they will get at least one or two good special teams players this year. Whether or not you trust any of one of those guys to get significant snaps on defense in the event of multiple injuries at that position remain to be seen. But you could have, a player like Nick Kwiatkowski who's still out there that basically was that dual threat, safe special teams guy and their break glass in case of emergency linebacker still out there available. So we'll see how things are looking in camp and if the Falcons do give him a phone call, a little bit later this summer or whatever. But, looking at the cornerback position, they added Clark Phillips. He's going to compete for that nickel cornerback spot. And I think the battle between him and potentially D. Alford is going to be one of the best and most entertaining battles of training camp this summer. Iron sharpens iron, as they often say. We did not see the Falcons get some outside cornerback help in this draft, but the presence of Phillips could potentially push Mike Hughes, who many people labeled as the front runner for that nickel cornerback spot, to the outside where he has historically been a much more effective cornerback, and that could be the challenger to Jeff Okudah to keep him on his toes this summer. And then, behind those guys, you have Jamal Peters, who the Falcons picked up from the CFL, Darren Hall, Cornell Armstrong. I feel like the Falcons have enough bodies right now at cornerback that they can feel comfortable getting through, mini camp and into training camp. But we'll obviously wonder, once we get into training camp, whether or not this is going to be a position that the Falcons might have to address before the season. Safety, adding the depth that they needed to get with DeMarco Hellams. I wouldn't be shocked if they wound up adding a couple more bodies after rookie mini camps. It just feels like, they only have 5 safeties on the roster, and it feels like you kind of got to at least go into training camp with like 7, possibly 8 or something like that, but we'll see how that goes. But switching to the offensive side of the ball, you like what the Falcons did on the offensive line. They got a plug and play left guard with Matthew Bergeron. They did not address the swing tackle position, but between Joshua Miles, Jermaine Ifedi, Tyler Vrabel, you have enough guys to compete on the outside at that swing tackle position. You also signed Ethan Greenidge, who also has experience playing both left and right tackle as well as guard. So I feel like Miles is the front runner to win that competition heading into training camp, but we'll just sort of have to see. It's also possible that with Bergeron, if he particularly takes well early this summer at the left guard position, you could move Jalen Ifedi. mixing Jalen Mayfield and Jermaine Ifedi. Jalen Mayfield back to tackle, although if you go back and listen to how I talked about Jalen Mayfield when we drafted him, I think he'd actually be a worse tackle than a guard in the NFL, but who knows? I also thought Matt Hennessy would be a worse guard than a center in the NFL, although that's probably still technically true, but he seemed to do just fine last year. And again, Dwayne Ledford can work miracles. And we'll see. That's, to me, that swing tackle position is going to be another position that we'll have to monitor throughout the summer and keep an eye on sort of potential cuts if the Miles and the Fetties and Vrabels of the world aren't going to hold it. They added center depth with Javon Gwynn as well on that offensive line. Tight end, they're good to go there. Running back, of course, adding Bijan Robinson, they're good to go there. Quarterback, we talked about for several weeks now, the Falcons weren't going to add a quarterback to the roster at this point, given the three that they have with Logan Woodside backing up Taylor Heineke and, of course, Desmond Ridder. Wide receiver is the one big lingering question, I think, on this roster. There's a couple of positions like linebacker or corner or safety that could be tweaked or whatever, but wide receiver is probably the one position that has a significant hole, because we thought we would get an addition in the draft. They did not get that player. They did bring in an undrafted free agent in Keelan Harris out of Oklahoma Baptist. And he's notable because Matt Wallman kind of mentioned him in passing on an episode we did last week about some of the Falcons wide receiver targets. And, that's a player to keep an eye on. And, he could be the new slot guy, right? And he could replace the old slot guy in OZ. Basically, could Keelan Harris be the new Olamide Zaccheaus? That's a legitimate question. I recall Matt Wallman also being a big fan of OZ on this podcast in the past. So we'll see how that goes. But wide receiver is going to be a notable position to keep an eye on. And it means we're entering a new era of here on the Locked On Falcons podcast, because the new theme on the podcast probably for the next 6 months in the lead up to the trade deadline, which I believe is October 31st this year. So 6 months from now, is this the week that the Falcons trade for Corey Davis with the New York Jets? So that may be something that you continue to hear over the next 26 weeks here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. Is this the week that we trade for Corey Davis? We'll see. So we'll keep an eye on that. But I'm sure some of you are wondering, like, do we really need to trade for Corey Davis, right? Do we really need that upgrade at wide receiver, right? Scotty Miller, Mac Hollins, Keelan Harris, Frank Darby, Bernie Sanders, all these guys are capable enough to fill the shoes at that wide receiver position, because who knows? Are we even going to need a wide receiver this year, given some of the various 22 personnel groupings that we're going to have this year, right? With Cordero Patterson and Bijan Robinson getting reps at wide receiver in the slot, with Kyle Pitts functioning as an outside receiver. Jonnu Smith not only playing tight end, but fullback. He'll be moved all over the formation. So do we really need a wide receiver that much? That's a conversation that is worth discussing. And I'm sure we will continue to break that down here on Locked On Falcons and all the various versatile, flexible ways that Arthur Smith can be creative on offense throughout the next several weeks as we break down this draft class and all the things that they can do. So it is absolutely exciting times and exciting stuff here for the Atlanta Falcons. I appreciate everybody that made today's episode their first listen. Continue to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and whatever you listen to, give us a 5-star review, help us out there in that regard. But if you want to provide your feedback on Jalen Carter or any of these topics that we're discussing, of course, you can do so via Twitter at Locked On Falcons, via Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can hit me up in the Discord on Locked On Falcons, the link in the description below. Guys, really appreciate it. Continue to make us your first listen. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Keith Sanchez and Damian Parson as they break down who won, who failed, who lost, who graded out well, all that stuff and more on the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.